The next thing we'll talk about are rules. Now, CSS has its own notion of rules, and that is where you're going to specify the class or the ID or the element type for you to pass on rules. In SASS, they're going to allow you to structure these rules in a logical way by implying several features, including nesting of hierarchies, so you can imply that cascading or specificity, and then allow SASS to deconstruct those into the regular CSS rules for you. Here we have a navigation container that has some properties. Here we have inside that navigation container an unordered list or UL element that we're specifying that there's no list type. And then finally, for each list item in that unordered list, we're specifying some properties. What SASS allows us to do is really change this into a structure of a hierarchy. Because they really are related to each other, this makes it a little easier for us to see this. So that nav still has its natural properties, and then the unordered list has its property, and then within the unordered list is that list item that has its properties. It's going to change this to this as it compiles the SASS into a CSS file. That's the nature of the way nested rules are supposed to work. Nested rules also support this notion of a parent selector, so that in case of things like hover, we can say when you build this, not only create the anchor tag for text decoration none, but also create a tag for a:hover without a space between them. The main reason for the use of mixing the parent is to make sure that the output of CSS treats it as a single rule declaration. So in this case, we're not only going to get the anchor tag specified with the text decoration, but then we're also going to get the hover because it's attached that rule to the A to create a second rule. The rules in SASS also allow you to nest properties as well. And the idea here is that sometimes you have related properties in CSS. Font is a good example of this, where there's font family, font size, font weight, etc. And it allows you to nest these as well. It takes the different syntax of it's actually the name of the base type, in this case font, with a colon and then a curly brace region where you're going to specify the sub properties. So by specifying font colon and then family and size separately, it's actually going to normalize them into the font family and font size that we see here. Let's go and refactor some of our rules using the techniques we've shown. So here we're back in our Better CSS project, and let's go down and look at an example of this. Here we have a pretty simple example, a footer and then a nav section inside the footer. What we really want to do is take this navigation section and nest it inside the footer, and I'll go ahead and indent it so it's a little easier to see, and then we can get rid of the duplication here because essentially we're going to end up with the same CSS we had a moment ago because it's going to take footer and then append the nav element for only those properties inside the nav section. Now the purpose of this is to make it a lot clearer and to reduce duplication for your rules. It should be easier to maintain as well as easier to see. It also has a sideline benefit of as you're adding new rules, whereas you could put them anywhere in CSS and you can still do that in SASS, this is really going to encourage you to keep them grouped together. As you're adding new rules around sub-elements of the footer, you're going to have a natural inclination to put them here near the footer because of the nesting. A more complex example is here in the nav. This is just like we saw on the slides. We can actually nest the unordered list section directly inside nav, and let me get rid of that duplication. And let's do the same thing for the list item. When we nest it inside of the unordered list inside the nav, again we're going several layers down, we can remove all this duplication, and so the code starts to look pretty simple. We have a nav section with an unordered list inside of it with a list item inside of it, and inside that list item there could be an anchor tag, and again let's remove all this duplication because this is going to end up generating all that same code, and then finally that hover tag inside the A. Now the hover tag is special here because instead of saying a hover, which would actually create it one level deep under hover, or just using colon hover here would create a space colon hover, we actually want to use this ampersand here to say when you attach this, attach it to the hover directly to really nest it as part of the parent. If we go and look at the code that's generated, let's navigate to our CSS file. We can see that even though it was all nested, it's going to denormalize these nav sections exactly the way we had them earlier, but it's going to denormalize them for us during the generation of the CSS. Same with the footer and the nav here. And the benefit here is that you're able to keep the structure and visually debug this stuff easier by looking at the SASS and letting the compiler really produce the CSS that's required by the browser. Let's make another change since we're here. And here we notice that there's a couple of font elements in our nav. We can actually make this a little clearer as well by using font colon and nesting the individual properties of the font as well. And so we know that this is going to be the size and the weight of the font property. So when we look at this in the browser, we can see that it's gone and created that font size and font weight in the way that CSS expects them, even though we created them in a little simpler way here. Now remember that you're not saving a lot of time for two of these, but for fonts, if you're setting weight and family, whether it's italic, those sorts of decorations all on there, it can make a lot more sense to group them together in this way. Let's head back to the slides. So the next feature of SASS that I want to talk about are directives. And these are elements that start with the @ sign that tell the processor to do certain things. We're going to look at the @import directive, the @extend directive, the @mixin, and then the @function directive. So in the @import, the goal here is to take some file and import it directly inside of another file at a specific space. And the file can be a CSS file, and in this case, when you're importing a CSS file, it actually just emits the import URL and then the path to the CSS file. This is the way you get the standard CSS import into the file. More commonly, though, you're going to import a SASS file as an embedded file directly in a main file. And this is a way that you can actually merge multiple SASS files together in a pretty common way instead of having to use another tool that will actually merge and even minify them. Note that you can either use the extension, or if you just use foo, it's going to expect that it's going to be a SASS-like extension, SCSS or SASS. You can also import within nesting as well. So it doesn't have to just be at the root level. It could be importing a small section of code directly into a section of your CSS. Let's see how this works. So here in our SASS file that we looked at earlier, we can see that this is importing a CSS file. And because of this, when we look at this file, it's actually converting this just to a CSS import statement, just like standard CSS would be. And this way you don't have to convert your whole project. You could continue to include standard CSS files without having to rename the files. But if we come back over here and we remove the CSS and just leave a init, it's going to attempt to find it as a SASS file. So let's go ahead and do that in our project. Rename this to be SCSS. Again, it's warning us about the file extension name change. That's fine. And this file doesn't have anything we're going to write any programmatic structure or anything with. It's actually just an init file that contains initialization for all the standard HTML pieces. By changing this to be a SASS file that we're importing instead of CSS, what's going to happen in the browser is it's actually going to import it directly into the outputted file. This means you're going to be making less round trips to the server to get them, and is a common way that as you start to compartmentalize your SASS, you're going to bring all the required pieces into a single file, and that way you have fewer number of CSS files that you're pulling down, even though structurally on the server you may have it structured into a lot of small little modules or pieces. A pretty common case here is to actually create some new SCS files, and I'm just going to create them with text files because there isn't a project template for an SCS file currently, and I'll just call this colors.scss. Now in this case, I'm going to go ahead and just declare some variables. So I've got black and blue both specified here. Now these aren't actually emitting any CSS, they're just declaring some variables that we want to use. Back in our main CSS, we'll want to import these as well, but these are imported before the processing happens. That way, we can go ahead and use those colors and that may be common to a number of different SASS files in one place. In fact, if we go ahead and look at this, we'll see that the black is still being preserved. It's not causing us an error because we're actually seeing the actual output based on that color variable. The color variable happens to be in the second file now, but because we're importing it, it's sort of like doing an include or an import in most programming languages. Let's head back to the slides. Another great feature of SASS is the ability to extend rules from other rules, and in essence creating inheritance inside of rules. Let's see this example. Let's say we have a rule defined for a button that says that the foreground color is going to be black. We can create a new sort of rule here for, let's say, submit buttons, and instead of having to copy the color black into our new button, we can say extend from button, and this is going to take what the values of the rule button and put them inside the submit button here. So it's actually going to create two different rules but share the basis for what is in the first rule. So this is going to emit submit button that has a border based on what we wrote, and then you'll notice that it's then emitting a rule for both button and submit button that both use that color black. So instead of embedding it into the second one, it actually did this correct CSS thing, which was let's create a rule for both the button and the submit button since they share that anyway. It supports multiple inheritance as well, so you can not only extend from a style or any rule, but also from a class, and so that you can really create a structure for reusable and base elements and base classes and things like that in a simple way using SASS. Let's see how this works. So let's show you how extends works. So in our header h1 rule, let's assume we want to extend this rule by using properties that are in another rule. Let's say the nav rule down here. Let's say we want to include those. We can say extend nav, start the extend with an at, and this is going to then create a rule that includes the nav element as well as the h1. If we save this and look at the browser, what we're actually going to see is that the h1 header here is no different from what you might expect. It's the same thing we were looking at before, but in order to extend it, it added it as a second element type in the rule for nav. And that's what extends actually does. It doesn't inject it like the import statement does. It says that also you take the header h1 here and use it where the nav is so that we get all those same rules applied. Great, let's head back to the slide.